What is up, fantasy fans? Welcome to The Data Straight, a new channel here on YouTube dedicated to analyzing real-world data to identify red-hot insight that you can use to improve your fantasy lineups. My name is Reese, a very warm welcome to you, and in today's video, we're going to look back at the results from the first 13 races to see if we can identify any data-driven changes you can make to your team to give yourself a competitive advantage going into the final 9 races of the season. Before we get into the video, something I want to make very clear is that I am not in any way affiliated with the Formula One brand or the company PlayOn that sponsors the game. I'm just a fan of the sport, a fan of the game, and I'm out here making videos on YouTube because I really love talking about this stuff and I want to find other like-minded people to share this with. So that being said, let's get into it. Okay, let's start by diving into the 2022 FDC, the Fantasy Drivers Championship, and a quick word on the visual components of this dashboard. The gold, silver, and bronze boxes are P1, P2, and P3 respectively, and then the bright red box is P20. I just want to point out that actual race results do not always map exactly onto fantasy race results. So Spain, for example, Max won the Spanish Grand Prix in real life, but he only managed P2 in fantasy because Sergio was awarded a race streak, which gifted him an extra 10 points, meaning that in the end, he beat Max by 4 points. Same at the other end of the table. Just because a driver DNFs, that doesn't guarantee they will have a bright red box around their score. So, no surprises here. Max is currently sitting P1 in the 2022 FDC. After a rough start to the year, it looked like back-to-back championships would be impossible for the young Dutchman, but Max has now won 6 out of 13 races, or 43% of the entire calendar. And this is wild, but Max has actually scored a staggering 12.8% of every point scored by every driver so far this season. Based on the last 13 races, Max will net you an average of 39.4 points per week, but something you have to bear in mind is that Max is a big-ticket driver, so those points don't come cheap. Next up, we have Charles Leclerc, who, after an amazing start to the season, has just not quite managed to hang on to Max as he breaks atmosphere and heads off in search of tracks beyond the stars. There's nothing I can say that hasn't already been said about Charles. He is an incredible driver and, in my mind, no doubt a future Formula One world champion, but 2022 is not his year. Currently, the gap between Max and Charles is widening every week as Leclerc's weekly average is 10.6 points lower than Max's. And his points are not consistent, which makes including or excluding Leclerc from your team a very difficult decision. One thing he does have over Max is that you can use your turbo driver mechanic on him. So if you have had Leclerc as your turbo driver every week, he will have scored you more points than Max could have scored you. But without that mechanic in vanilla play, Max has a comfortable lead over Charles. Next up, it's the Mercedes drivers, George and Lewis, in that order. Formerly Mr. Saturday, now Mr. Consistent, for the first 9 races, George was netting you at least 26 points per race. Obviously, we all know what happened at Silverstone with the DNF, but if you take his single point from that weekend out of the equation, his lowest score is then still that magic 26 points. And so far across the season, his average is just 0.4 points lower than Leclerc. But with Leclerc being £5.1 million cheaper, Leclerc's points are more cost effective. Next up, we have Sir Lewis, who is just on a dynamite run of form at the moment. Since Canada, Lewis has been on the podium in every single race. He has 1 win, 3 P2s and 1 P3. And after a rough start to the season, Lewis is now very much fighting with George and Leclerc for P2. After Lewis, we have Sergio Perez, who is actually 2 places down comparing his real-life position to his fantasy position. Sergio had a great run from Australia to Azerbaijan, but after clocking a negative score in Canada, he's not quite been able to break back into the podium places, and that's having a big effect on his overall score. Going into Spa, there's just 20 points between Sergio in P5 and Lewis in P4, so one good race and Sergio could reclaim P4, but it's a big ask with the run of form Lewis is on right now. After Sergio, we have Carlos, who of course got his maiden victory at Silverstone this year, but Carlos is carrying a big -5 and a 0, which means that although he is in a race-winning car, the best he's been able to manage after 13 races is the final spot in the top 6. For me, picking between Sergio and Carlos each week has been a real challenge because their overall scores are comparable, their prices are very similar, so you can afford to swap one in, one out, but week to week, they almost do the exact opposite of each other. So if you get the call wrong, it's almost a double hit. Take Australia. Let's say you swapped Sergio out and put Carlos in. Not only does Carlos get you -5, but you miss out on Sergio's +35. Or the exact opposite. Let's say you swapped Carlos out for Sergio at Canada. Not only do you get -8 for Sergio, but you miss out on Carlos's +45. Over the course of the season, these two have scored huge points, but you have to make the right call week to week, or you risk spending 17-18 million pounds on bad results. If you got this right every week, you'd have a maximum of 461 points from these drivers, excluding turbos. But if you got it wrong, you'd only have a minimum of 192 points, which is 58% short of the max. Moving down the table now, we'll pick up with Mick in P15, who after a bad start has really emerged as the back marker to have in your team. Yes, he has been rock bottom on 2 separate occasions, but for 6.3 million, he is now scoring some serious points. And when we look at the points per million table, which I'll show you a little later, I think you'll be really surprised to see how well he is performing. After Mick, it's Danny Rick. And look, Daniel is a driver that you want to include in your team. But at 13.6 million, with his current form, the 93 points he has scored are really, really expensive. Hungary wasn't his worst score of the year. That came in Saudi. But it did mark the first time he finished P20 in a race. And that little red box kind of perfectly sums up his season so far. The thing is, he has had a few moments of brilliance. At his home race and in Canada, he scored a respectable 18 points. But those moments of brilliance are separated by these long periods of single-digit returns. So as much as I hate to say it, based on his current form, Daniel is not a good pick for your teams. But I think we probably already knew that. Next up is K-Mag, and this is another sad song. So after scoring a whopping 41 points in his first 2 races, it would take Kevin 9 more races to score another 51 points. And since Austria, back-to-back negative scores means that net across 11 races, Kevin has only scored 46 points on top of the 41 he scored in the first 2 races. The problem with picking Kevin is that 45% of his scores are negative. That's what's really hurting him. Personally, I've stuck with K-Mag a lot longer than I should have. I'm so happy to see him racing again, but as a fantasy pick in recent weeks, his results have been disappointing. Up next, we have Latifi, and what's so frustrating about Latifi is that some weeks he goes out there and scores you double digits. But then, over the course of the last 4 races, he's actually netted -4 points. So, including him in your team literally costs you 1 point per race and the opportunity cost of having an actual point-scoring driver. What that means for me for the next 9 races is that Latifi is probably a pass when you consider that you can get Mick and then have an extra 1 million in the bank to spend on other drivers. After Latifi, it's Guan Yu Zhou, and his score kind of reflects the fact that this is his first year in Formula One. Quick story, I actually crossed paths with Guan Yu Zhou very briefly at the Goodwood Festival of Speed earlier this year. He was being moved from one area to another by his entourage, so I couldn't speak to him, but it was actually really cool just to see him in person. Guan Yu Zhou's first 4 races looked really promising from a value perspective, but then back-to-back P20 started a run that means over the last 9 races, he has only scored 12 points. It's a tough one. Hopefully he comes back after the break and scores some good points because Valtteri is proof that the car is capable, and if you could swap Valtteri out and put Guan Yu Zhou in with confidence, you'd gain 1.4 million back in budget that you could spend elsewhere. Last but not least, and this might surprise you, we have Yuki. So year on year, that AlphaTauri car has fallen off a cliff. We can all see that. But to be rock bottom after 13 races, it tells me that something is amiss with Yuki this year. At 8.4 million, he was probably fair value going into the season, but at this point, with a weekly average of just 2.4 points per race, Yuki is a clear pass. He did have one moment of pure brilliance at the Emilia-Romagna Grand Prix where he scored 30 points, but it's not enough to justify having him in your team. If you put him in for that race, you're a genius. Okay, so we've looked at the top 6, we've looked at the bottom 6. What we'll do in the next video is spend some time in the middle because picking the right combination out of Lando, Esteban, Valtteri, Fernando, and even Lance and Seb, that deserves a video of its own. But for now, we'll move on to look at the championship visualized. Starting at the top, Max's lead over Leclerc is huge, and for me, it's not likely that Charles can recover the gap. If you look at Monaco, you can actually see it was here at Leclerc's home race where the championship changed hands, and since then, Max has just gone parabolic. If you jump ahead and you look at Canada, you'll actually see that George was P2 by the slimmest of margins for one single race, because of course the next race was Silverstone, where George had his first and only DNF of the season. But yeah, Canada is where things really started to heat up. Lewis took his first win of the season, and since Canada, he has really been bringing home the points. So now, going into Belgium, there's just 32 points separating Charles, George, Lewis and Sergio. And you can't count Carlos out because Carlos is only 33 points off of Sergio. Further down the chart, you then have another close fought competition between Lando, Esteban, Valtteri and Fernando. And although they're not on here because this is just the top 10, Lance and Seb are also in the mix. The lead here is more commanding. Lando has a 62 point lead over Fernando. But if we isolate Fernando, you can see here, he has been on this monster run of form since Miami. And if things continue at this pace, he won't be P10 for long, especially when you look at Valtteri, who is sadly kind of plateauing and is actually at risk of even falling away, maybe to be replaced by Lance. Okay, so we've looked at the individual performances. Let's now take a quick look at how each driver's points compare to their teammate. This might surprise you, but after 13 races, the biggest points gap in fantasy is not Daniel to Lando, it's actually Sergio to Max. The points gap between the Red Bull drivers currently stands at 169 points in favour of Max. Leclerc leads Carlos by 65 points, which feels about right, and then it's the Mercedes drivers, Lewis and George, and this battle is just so close. Only 6 points separate these two drivers, and there's no denying that George had the upper hand at the start of the season, but as we've already seen, before the break, Lewis was on a monster run. So will Lewis overtake George, build a gap, or is George going to come back well rested and swing for the fences? Time will tell. You hate to see it, and I don't want to labour on it any more than we already have, but Lando leads Daniel by 133 points. Will Daniel still be here next year? At this point, we don't know because we don't know how the Piastri situation will play out. But this points gap is a pretty clear statement from Lando to the world. Come back to us, Daniel. If we'd have known that the last shoey we saw would have been the last shoey we'd ever see, we would have really savoured the flavour. Up next, it's Alpine, and this is a great one. So I've really struggled with this decision all year, Esteban or Fernando. As you saw earlier, I think the right answer in recent weeks has been Fernando, but Esteban still scores big points week in, week out, and just 0.3 million separates these two. So the data tells you that there's not necessarily a wrong answer, but there is maybe a more right answer. And across the first half of the season, the more right answer is Esteban. But will that still be true at the end of the season? Based on Fernando's current form, no, probably not. Valtteri is absolutely dominating Guan Yu Zhou. The current points gap is evidence of that. But in recent weeks, Valtteri is starting to struggle. Valtteri's only managed to score 9 points in the last 4 races. So there is a chance Guan Yu Zhou can close the gap, but he would probably need another full season of races to do it. And Valtteri could just switch it back on at any time. Next up, it's Aston Martin, Lance and Seb. Man, this is even closer than Lewis and George. Just 3 points separate these two drivers, and it's pretty much been single digits separating them ever since Seb scored a whopping 25 points in Azerbaijan. We need to keep our eye on Lance because at 9.1 million, he is definitely undervalued relative to the points he scores. Pierre currently has a big lead over Yuki, and as we've already said, Yuki is not looking so hot this year, so it's hard to imagine this gap does anything other than expand over time. Similar story with Albon and Latifi, but to a lesser degree. Albon is beating Latifi most weeks, but his margin of victory is much smaller, so yes, I do expect to see this gap continue expanding over time, but not to the same extent that I'm expecting to see with Pierre and Yuki. Last is K-Mag and Mick, and this really could go either way for me. K-Mag had a blinding start to the season, but Mick has really just switched it on in recent weeks. In fact, what we'll look at next really shows how dominant Mick has been in the last 6 races. So will it end like this? Are we in for a close fought battle? Who should you pick for the final 9 races? I think I'm going with Mick. Okay, so now we've looked at the drivers' individual performances, we've compared them to their teammates, but something that is key to succeeding in fantasy is balancing risk and making cost-effective decisions. What we'll look at next is a revised championship where we're dividing the number of points scored by the driver by the cost of the driver to create a points per pound championship. And this is a really interesting story because it's very subtly different to the Fantasy Drivers' Championship. In P1, it's Charles Leclerc. Even with his 3.5s, Charles still sits P1 in the points per pound championship because he only costs 18.7 million. His points are essentially the best value points your money can buy. So for me, even though there is a huge risk including him in the team, Leclerc is still my turbo driver most weeks. Next up is Sergio, who is right on Leclerc's tail, trailing him by just 1 point and 0.1 points on the weekly average. Sergio represents great value, and in a way, it makes the whole Ferrari-Red Bull decision a little bit easier. If you run with Leclerc and Sergio, you have representation from both Ferrari and Red Bull, and you're very likely to have at least one podium between them. If you're able to bring Valtteri, Carlos and Lance into the mix, you'd actually have scored at least one podium in 92% of the races. And that lineup only costs 72.5 million, which gives you enough to buy Ferrari as your constructor. Is that what you should do? Maybe, maybe not. It's super cost effective, and across the season, it would have netted you a total of 2,345 points, assuming Leclerc was your turbo driver every week. So if your team has scored less than 2,345 points, you might want to consider minimizing risk and going with a more cost-effective team in the final 9 races. Just because of how much he costs, I think it's worth mentioning, Max will set you back 30.4 million this year, and yet he's still the 6th most cost-effective pick so far in 2022. Just let that sink in. One thing I do want to spend a minute on before jumping down the page is Mick. So currently P9, you'll see a tale of 2 extremes for Mick. Out of the 13 races, Mick has been on the podium in 38% of the races, and he has been the most cost-effective choice in 31% of the races. But he has also been the worst pick in 15% of the races, and it's fair to say he's been zero impact or minimal impact in 38% of the races. So literally, in 77% of the races, Mick has either been a great pick or a terrible pick, and that's a very dangerous game to play. There's nothing surprising at the other end of the table, apart from the pain of being a Danny Ric fan being driven home with more force than Lewis and his delaminated tyre at Silverstone in 2020, so we'll skip over that. If we jump into the chart, you can see just how dominant Mick has been in recent weeks. If we isolate Mick's data, you can see his parabolic rise starting in Azerbaijan, where he was 3.9 points adrift of P9, to now just 5 races later, where he is now in P9 after overtaking Lando, and he's just 0.3 points off of overtaking George, who currently sits in P8. The data tells you that Mick is a clear pick for the final 9 races based on his current form. Something else worth looking at is the interaction between Valtteri, Charles and Sergio. Charles was top dog by a comfortable margin until Spain, when Valtteri took the fight to him, and then after Leclerc's disastrous race at Monaco, Valtteri actually claimed top spot, where he stayed until Austria. While Valtteri sat at the top, Leclerc and Sergio had a heated battle for P2, trading places week after week after week, until Leclerc went into Austria in P3, but managed to end the weekend in P1. Valtteri's now slipped from P1 to P2 to P3 over the course of 4 races. It's still very close between Valtteri and Sergio. Valtteri is sitting on 18.6, Sergio is sitting on 18.7. So going into Belgium, it's pretty much as close as it gets. Also, the reason we have a little K-Mag and a Yuki down here is because they have been top on 3 occasions, but they're outside the top 10. So to prevent these charts from becoming overwhelming, I'm only showing the top 10 drivers. Okay, so conscious I've been recording for 20 minutes now and we've only covered the drivers. I want these videos to be short and digestible, so in the interest of time, I'm only going to spend a few minutes talking about the constructors. No surprises here, Red Bull are on top, but who currently sits in P2 might surprise you because, as you can see, it's actually Mercedes. Why? Well, Mercedes have actually scored the most points in all 3 of the last 3 races, and that's basically because they're not experiencing any major issues and both drivers are finishing pretty much every race. What's also really interesting is Mercedes and McLaren are now the only constructors not to have been the worst pick in any single week. In fact, Mercedes have actually been on the podium in 92% of all races so far this season. They've literally only missed out on 1 podium. Red Bull obviously had a terrible start to the season, and Ferrari plus Baku equals tears in Tifosi, so where Merc have not had a dreaded double DNF, or to be fair, had any real major problems beyond the obvious lack of competitiveness, they've managed to grind their way into P2. Does that mean you should log on and swap your constructor out for Mercedes this weekend? Maybe not, because their price tag is high, and if we jump into the points per pound for constructors, you'll see that Mercedes dropped from 2nd to 5th, so it's not an obvious pick. No doubt they're a great pick, but they're not an obvious pick. The title of obvious pick is a difficult one to assign. The real winners are making the right pick between Red Bull and Ferrari week in, week out, as one or the other has won 69% of the races so far this season. But that still doesn't make either one of them the obvious pick, because if you wanted a more cost-effective constructor to free up more budget for drivers, then you could easily argue that Aston Martin is the best pick. If we jump into the chart, you'll actually see that Alfa Romeo, on average, was the best pick from Bahrain to Canada. But since Canada, Alfa have really fallen off a cliff, dropping from P1 to P7 in just 4 races. One thing that is evident from this chart is that AlphaTauri are a clear pass, because for an extra 0.4 million, you can get the 3rd most cost-effective team, or if you want to go the other way, you can put 4.2 million back in your budget, go with Haas, and then you still have the 6th most cost-effective team. Okay, that is it for this first video. This has ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be, and in the interest of respecting your time, I've opted to leave a lot of the commentary on the cutting room floor. If this was useful for you, stay tuned to the channel, because I'm going to be uploading another video very soon going over my personal picks for Spa. If you're still with us at this point, thank you so much for taking 20 minutes out of your day to look at this with me. I really appreciate your time. I hope you have a great day ahead, and I'll see you again very soon.